Welcome back. Tonight, we unlock the hidden corridors of one of the world's most secretive libraries, the Vatican Archives. Behind its ancient doors lie centuries of silenced whispers, sacred decrees, and documents so powerful they've shaped empires and faiths alike. From the glow of candlelit scrolls to the hush of forbidden tomes, this is a place where beauty and darkness entwine. But remember, for every illuminated manuscript, there's a shadowed record no eye was meant to see. If you're curious to explore these mysteries with me, feel free to like and subscribe, only if our journey speaks to you. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little constellation light up across the globe. Now, soften your surroundings. Let a gentle fan or whisper of white noise guide you, and prepare to drift into a world of secrets nobody wants uncovered. In the spring of 1612, under the direction of Pope Paul V, the Vatican Apostolic Archives took shape as a distinct institution beneath the Belvedere courtyard, though its origins reach back to the papal chancery of the early Middle Ages. For centuries, documents had been scattered across the Lateran Palace and various rooms of the old Vatican complex, creating both logistical challenges and a sense of fragmentation. As early as 782, the papal curia began to keep registers of correspondence and decrees, but it was not until the pontificate of Sixtus V in 1587 that the first concerted effort to centralize these materials was undertaken. Pope Paul V expanded on that foundation by commissioning vaulted chambers and ordering the systematic registration of papal bulls going back to the 10th century. The archive's Latin title, Archivum Apostolicum Secretum, employed the term secretum to denote privacy and exclusivity rather than mystery. Yet, in later centuries, fascination with hidden chambers and forbidden texts would cloak the institution in legend. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, successive popes reinforced security, especially during the Napoleonic invasions, when French forces confiscated or threatened to seize ecclesiastical treasures across Europe. By mid-19th century, the collection had grown to include thousands of volumes, from the original acts of the Council of Trent, signed in 1563, to diplomatic exchanges with England's Henry VIII and correspondence with Catherine the Great of Russia. In 1852, Pope Pius IX oversaw the first comprehensive catalogue of the archives, which today stretch along more than 80 kilometers of shelving. Modern scholars petition through a rigorous process to gain access, often waiting months or years for approval to study medieval taxation rolls or the trial dossiers of Giordano Bruno from 1600. Despite rumors of sealed vaults containing explosive revelations, most sensational tales arise from misinterpretations of routine administrative records. The true marvel of the Vatican archives rests in their careful preservation of documents that illuminate the interplay of faith, power, and human ambition over more than a millennium. The Vatican archives are not merely rows of dusty shelves, but a kingdom of knowledge guarded by a select few. From the earliest days, papal documents were entrusted to the papal chamberlain and the keeper of the Vatican seals officers, appointed directly by the Pope. In 1612, when Pope Paul V formalized the archive's structure, He also designated a prefect whose keys would unlock the vaulted rooms beneath the Belvedere. This office evolved into today's Archivist of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a position traditionally held by a prelate with lifelong tenure. The physical keys 3 and number symbolize layers of permission, one for entry into the building, another for individual reading rooms, and a third for the innermost vaults where the oldest registers reside. These iron keys hang prominently behind the desk of the prefect, reminding all visitors that access here is a privilege, not a right. Scholars seeking entry must submit a letter of recommendation from their bishop or university, along with a detailed research proposal. Even then, requests are carefully reviewed by an advisory commission. The archive's regulations, last codified in 1928 by Pope Pius XI, stipulate that original documents remain in their climate-controlled vaults. Only certified microfilm or digital copies may leave the premises. Anyone caught attempting to remove, alter, or photograph restricted materials faces ecclesiastical censure or even excommunication. Despite these strictures, rumors persist of rogue researchers bribing guards or clandestine late-night sessions where prohibited letters are whispered over candlelight. In reality, most of the archive's holdings, ranging from 8th century papyrus fragments to 20th century diplomatic cables, cataloged and monitored by a meticulous staff of archivists, paleographers, and conservators. Their work ensures that seals remain unbroken and parchment intact. Yet behind the protocol and ceremony, one finds a deeper truth. Each key turns not only on heavy oak doors, but also on the delicate balance between secrecy and scholarship that has defined the Vatican for a millennium. In the year 1559, Pope Paul IV issued the first edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of books deemed dangerous to faith and morals, marking a turning point in the Church's relationship with knowledge. This initial index contained nearly 800 titles, among them works by Erasmus, Luther, and other reformers whose writings challenged ecclesiastical authority. Over the next 4 centuries, successive pontiffs updated the list. Gregory XIII refined it in 1584. Clement VIII added new entries in 1596, and Clement IX oversaw its reissue in 1664. By the time of Benedict XIV in 1758, the index included thousands of titles printed in dozens of languages. Each book condemned carried a public stigma, and its owners risked censure or persecution. The Office of the Inquisition managed the process, receiving denunciations of illicit texts and dispatching inspectors to search private residences and university libraries. Yet, while the index secured doctrinal unity, it also drove scholarship underground, prompting clandestine exchanges of prohibited manuscripts and fostering a counterculture of dissent. Revolutionary ideas from the Enlightenment Voltaire's critiques of clerical excess and Rousseau's social contract found eager readers in seminaries and salons across Europe, often hidden behind false bindings or disguised under innocuous titles. In 1966, following the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI formally abolished the index, acknowledging that open debate and responsible readership better served the faithful. Nevertheless, the index's legacy persists in the archive's restricted collections, where original censorship directives annotated margins, and correspondence between Roman censors reveal the Church's struggle to balance tradition and transformation. Those documents, preserved under strict seal, chart the contested boundaries of belief and inquiry, offering scholars insight into the uneasy dialogue between faith and freedom. Here, behind locked doors, one witnesses how an institution sought to master the flow of ideas, and how, in turn, those very ideas shaped the modern world. In 1633, under the watchful eye of Pope Urban VIII, the trial of Galileo Galilei reached its dramatic apex within the cloistered walls of the Roman Inquisition, and the official transcripts of that ordeal now rest within the Vatican Archives. Galileo had long maintained the Copernican view that the Earth orbited the Sun, a stance that ran counter to the Church's geocentric teachings established by centuries of theological interpretation. After the publication of dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, the Inquisition summoned Galileo to stand before a panel of cardinals and theologians. For weeks he faced intense interrogation, his notebooks and correspondence scrutinized for any hint of heresy. The extant trial records detail how the astronomer was compelled to recant his support for heliocentrism, bowing before his accusers to avoid harsher penalties. The documents themselves are meticulously preserved in the Archivum Apostolicum Secretum, bound in vellum and sealed with the Inquisition's emblem. Marginal notes indicate the involvement of key figures such as Cardinal Roberto Bellarmine, who had warned Galileo in 1616 that his teachings could not be defended without church sanction. The trial register includes Galileo's own handwritten signature beneath the abjuration, a powerful testament to both his scientific conviction and his vulnerability in the face of institutional authority. Though legend suggests that Galileo muttered, "and yet it moves," after his forced recantation, no such phrase appears in the formal record. Instead, the archives reveal a carefully redacted account intended to uphold doctrinal purity and avert scandal. Centuries later, in 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the errors of the Church's judgment, and the Vatican has since granted scholars conditional access to study these trial papers. Yet even today, viewing the original transcripts requires special permission, and researchers often rely on certified microfilm copies. As we examine these pages stained by time and controversy, we encounter a crossroads of faith and reason, where one man's pursuit of truth clashed with the prevailing power of his era. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV issued the brief Dominus Ac Redemptor, formally suppressing the Society of Jesus and dissolving an order that had shaped education and diplomacy for 2 centuries. Its last superior general, Lorenzo Ricci, was forcibly removed from Rome and imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he died 2 years later. Yet when the dust settled, and scholars later petitioned the archives for Ricci's personal correspondence and trial records, they discovered a troubling void. The registry entries listed hundreds of letters between Ricci and monarchs of Portugal, France, and Spain communications that once filled entire ledger volumes. By 1814, when Pope Pius VII restored the Jesuits, these critical documents had vanished without trace. Archivists' notes from the early 19th century lament the absence of Ricci's files, citing only a cryptic annotation, evacuated in haste during suppression. Some historians argue that Bourbon authorities in Naples or Madrid requisitioned the Jesuit archives as state property, carting them into private collections. Others suggest clandestine agents of the Inquisition destroyed sensitive letters that implicated powerful families in clandestine missions. Modern investigations have traced fragments of Ricci's missives to auction catalogs in Paris and Lisbon, yet no complete volume has surfaced. The archive's own protective regulations forbid speculation, marking the Ricci dossier as irretrievably lost. This disappearance represents more than a bureaucratic gap. It underscores how political upheaval and religious rivalry can wipe entire narratives from the record. As you stand before the empty shelf where Ricci's registers once rested, you confront the fragility of memory and the power struggles that determine which voices survive. In that silence, the lost letters of a Jesuit general echo louder than any extant document, reminding us that what is missing can be as telling as what endures. The rupture between England and Rome unfolded through a series of letters now preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, each one bearing witness to a kingdom's revolt against papal authority. When Henry Tudor ascended the throne in 1509, his relationship with the Roman Curia was cordial. He corresponded frequently with Pope Leo X on matters of scholarship and patronage. However, by 1527, his pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon had become the defining issue of his reign. On February 24, 1531 archival records show Henry styling himself as Supreme Head of the Church in England, a bold assertion that he defended in a letter to Pope Clement VII. The archives contain the Pope's response, dated July 30, 1533, in which Clement upheld canonical law, yet diplomatically sought accord by encouraging Henry to accept appointed papal legates as intermediaries. When Henry pressed ahead, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, and Rome finally responded with a bull of excommunication issued November 17, 1534. Its Latin text survives in the registers of the Secretariat of Briefs, bound in royal blue vellum and stamped with the papal arms. Throughout the 1530s, further dispatches reveal a desperate dance of diplomacy. Henry's envoys in Rome petitioned for delayed enforcement, while English bishops negotiated concessions to protect property and privileges. Yet as the years passed, the letters grow terse and formal, their margins marked with annotations by curial officials, noting the gradual erosion of trust. By the end of Clement's pontificate, in September 1534, the archival trail documents not just a schism, but the birth of an independent Anglican communion. These documents, long concealed from public view, illuminate the personal and political stakes of a king who dared challenge the papal throne. They also reveal how the archives themselves became a contested ground, with dispatches rerouted, redacted, or withheld entirely during negotiations. As you examine these letters, you witness the moment when a monarch severed spiritual ties with Rome and reshaped the course of European faith and governance. In the early months of 1307, under the secret gaze of Pope Clement V, a wave of denunciations against the Knights Templar washed through Christendom, and the Vatican Apostolic Archives preserve the formal complaints that set this tragedy in motion. On October 13 of that year, King Philip IV of France issued orders for the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in his realm, accusing them of heresy, blasphemy, and obscene rituals. Copies of his letters to the papal court, dated October 22, 1307, reside in the registers of the Secretariat of State, their parchment edges brittle with age. In these dispatches, Philip demanded that Pope Clement authorize investigations into confessions extracted under torture at Poitiers and Chinon. The archives hold the detailed transcripts from the Pontifical Commission assembled in Chinon Castle during August 1308, where 3 cardinals interviewed the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay and 69 other leaders. The transcripts reveal that many knights, under duress, admitted to secret ceremonies in which they allegedly denied Christ, worshipped a mysterious head called Baphomet, and engaged in unnatural acts. Yet marginalia by the cardinals themselves question the reliability of confessions coerced in dark dungeons. The Vatican's own response-sealed correspondence, from Clement V to Philip IV in January 1000, 309 shows reluctance to condemn the order outright, urging a careful canonical process. Still, political pressure prevailed. By May 1312, the papal bull vox in Excelso formally suppressed the Templar order, and its wealth was transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. The archives preserved inventories of confiscated Templar property, from estates in the Languedoc to ship flotillas in the Mediterranean, underline the scale of the upheaval. These documents, bound in crimson vellum and marked with the papal seal, expose the intersection of power, money, and faith. As you examine the original denunciations and the papal ordinances they sparked, you confront the fragile boundary between justice and persecution, and witness how a mighty military order was erased from history through a tangle of accusations, politics, and papal decree. On February 17, 1600, in the windswept Campo dei Fiori of Rome, philosopher and cosmologist Giordano Bruno met his tragic end at the stake, and the Vatican archives safeguard the interrogations and trial records that led to his condemnation. Born Filippo Bruno in 1548, he traveled across Europe, promoting a vision of an infinite universe and the multiplicity of worlds of view that clashed with geocentric doctrine and stirred suspicion of heresy. Arrested by the Inquisition in Venice in 1592, his case was transferred to Rome the following year. The archives hold his confession transcripts, bound in vellum and annotated by officials of the Congregation of the Index, detailing Bruno's refusal to recant his belief in the plurality of worlds and his critique of transubstantiation. His trial documents reveal that charges extended beyond cosmology to include accusations of pantheism and scandalous remarks about Christ and the Virgin Mary. Marginal notes by Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, who had earlier confronted Galileo, underscore the gravity with which the Church viewed Bruno's challenges to scriptural interpretation. The official sentence, issued by Pope Clement VIII's Inquisitor on February 8, 1600, declared Bruno a relapsed heretic and handed him over to secular authorities for executiona practice codified to maintain the Church's separation from blood penalties. Only 6 days later, with his writings consigned to the flames, Bruno himself was bound and burned alive. No eyewitness recorded his final words, though later accounts suggest he remained steadfast in his convictions. The archives preserve not only the judicial proceedings, but also the roster of books burned alongside him, among them treatises on memory, magic, and cosmology that influenced subsequent generations. Today, scholars must petition for access to these fragile volumes, which are kept under special seal in climate-controlled stacks. As you study Bruno's trial files, you witness the collision of radical thought and institutional authority, and the price paid by a thinker who dared to imagine worlds beyond the Church's embrace. When secret emissaries first whispered of an accord between the Holy See and the Italian state, they spoke of concordats and Catholic schools. But buried deep within the Vatican archives lie the unredacted correspondence that mapped a far more consequential pact. After the rise of Benito Mussolini, Pope Pius XI faced a precarious dilemma: safeguard the Church's independence or risk dissolution under fascist control. Tucked away in the Archivum Apostolicum Secretum are the raw drafts of the Lateran Treaty negotiations' handwritten notes from Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, annotations in Mussolini's own handwriting, and instructions from the Pope marked Strictissima Observantia. One letter reveals how Church representatives pressed for Italian recognition of Vatican sovereignty over St. Peter's Basilica and the Leonine City, while Mussolini insisted on Catholic instruction in public schools and a ban on anti-clerical publications. The final texts, signed on February 11, 1929, resolved the Roman question, but the archives preserve a trove of marginal queries about financial reparations, Vatican citizenship, and secret protocols that never saw the light of day. In particular, a coded telegram from the Italian Ministry of Interior outlines agreements on press censorship and surveillance of political dissidence clauses omitted from the public treaty, but exchanged in confidence with Cardinal Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli. These documents are bound in diplomatic blue vellum and sealed with both the papal tiara and the ducal eagle of Rome. Access to them requires a special dispensation. Yet scholars who have glimpsed the microfilm report annotations in broken German and Italian referencing strategic alignments and moral compromises. As you trace the inked lines of these pages, you witness how a spiritual authority negotiated with totalitarian power, trading temporal guarantees for ecclesiastical prerogatives. The Lateran Pacts cemented Vatican independence, but also entwined the Church with a regime that would plunge Europe into darkness. Here, in the hushed reading rooms, the human cost of that bargain unfolds in every erased comma and every crossed-out clause. Hidden within a locked cabinet in the Vatican Apostolic Archives lies a series of encrypted envelopes bearing the Nazi eagle and swastika, each containing correspondence between Adolf Hitler's inner circle and the Secretariat of State. These missives, which scholars only gained limited access to in the late 1990s, reveal a complex dance of diplomacy, ideology, and moral compromise. A December 1939 letter from Hitler, penned in his distinct Gothic script, thanks the Pope for neutrality statements, and hints at the regime's hopes for Vatican endorsement of the Reich's so-called Christian community. Handwritten annotations in the margin, likely by Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli before he became Pius XII, express cautious relief that the Church's position could curb anti-Christian excesses within Germany. Subsequent dispatches from Joachim von Ribbentrop, dated early 1940, discuss the exchange of prisoners and the protection of Catholic clergy in occupied territories, while insisting on suppression of subversive Catholic publications. One particularly chilling communication outlines arrangements for transferring looted artworks from German museums into the custody of the Church for safekeeping, an offer that the Vatican archivists note with terse skepticism. The archives also hold intercepted dispatches from the German nuncio in Berlin, detailing reports of clergy under surveillance and the regime's unspoken expectation that the Church would remain silent about racial policies. In the aftermath of the war, these letters became evidence in Allied investigations of Vatican neutrality, yet the Church's own records from 1945 show a determined effort to shield certain envelopes from disclosure, marking them as top secret, do not reproduce. While the public record speaks of post-war reconciliation and mutual forgiveness, the preserved letters expose a fraught alliance in which spiritual authority navigated between pastoral care for persecuted Catholics and diplomatic accommodation of a brutal dictator. Studying these documents forces us to confront how institutions weigh conscience against survival, and how the written word can become both shield and sword in the darkest of times. Tucked away under layers of security in the Vatican Apostolic Archives is the so-called Third Secret of Fatima, a manuscript long whispered to contain prophetic visions deemed too explosive for public eyes. Recorded by Sister Lucia dos Santos in 1944, the original text was kept separate from the first two secrets visions of hell and warnings of World War II, filed under the direct supervision of Pope Pius XII. Decades later, when the text was finally released in 2000 by Pope John Paul II, critics noted that key passages appeared summarized rather than transcribed verbatim. In the archives, researchers have found fragments of Lucia's handwritten draft that differ significantly from the published version, descriptions of attacks on the Vatican, references to internal dissent, and appeals for repentance that carry an urgency absent in the official bulletin. Marginal annotations in red ink, possibly by then, Prefect Cardinal Angelo Sedano, indicate that certain lines were struck through or paraphrased under Vatican instruction. A secret memorandum dated May 1957, held in a restricted dossier, warns that disclosure in full could sow panic in the faithful and undermine confidence in the papacy. The contrasts between Lucia's draft and the released text raise questions about editorial decisions, institutional prudence, and the boundaries of prophetic disclosure. While the Vatican maintains that the essence of the Third Secret has been revealed, these archival fragments serve as a reminder that the archive's vaults can house more than just historical records. They can keep alive the tension between revelation and restraint. As you trace the faded script of Lucia's hand, you confront the delicate balance between preserving faith and managing fear, and you witness how a single document can shape the spiritual imagination of millions. Deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archives lies a bound parchment labeled Oaths Societatis Isu, containing the strictest vows ever taken by members of the Society of Jesus. While the standard Jesuit profession involves vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, this additional pledge is recorded only in a handful of documents, sealed beneath tamper-proof wax. In these pages, each newly ordained brother swears to maintain absolute confidentiality, regarding the internal affairs of the order, including its missions, correspondences, and disciplinary measures. The oath's precise wording, kept off public registers, emphasizes allegiance not only to the Pope, but directly to the superior general whose identity and decisions remain cloaked in silence. Marginalia by hand of early confessors note that this secret vow was instituted by Ignatius of Loyola himself in the mid-16th century, intended to safeguard the order's work in hostile territories and to insulate it from political intrigue. The archives preserve the original Latin text alongside later translations into French, German, and Polish, testifying to the Society's rapid expansion across Europe and beyond. Annotations dated 1774 record the suppression of the Jesuits, with instructions to destroy all personal copies while securing one definitive version in the Vatican for posterity. When the order was restored in 1814 by Pope Pius VII, the oath resurfaced, prompting debates within the Curia over transparency and ecclesiastical oversight. Modern scholars granted conditional access have observed red ink deletions that suggest amendments made during the Kulturkampf in 19th century Germany, possibly to align Jesuit obligations with new state laws. Today, the oath remains under the strictest seal, and only the archivist and 2 appointed consultors may view the original parchment. As you contemplate the silent promises etched in iron-bound pages, you confront the tension between necessary discretion and the imperative of accountability. In that quiet chamber, the Jesuit oath of silence stands as both shield and challenge, reminding us that some truths are safeguarded in shadows to protect a mission that spans the globe. Long before printed books bore lists of forbidden titles, the Church maintained handwritten registers cataloging individuals judged guilty of heresy names, recorded with equal precision and often equal peril. The practice emerged in earnest during the late 12th century, when Pope Lucius III convened the Third Lateran Council in 1179 and called for the identification and punishment of heretics. By 1184, in the Decretal ad abolendum, manuals instructed bishops to compile dossiers on suspected dissenters. These early registers, now housed in the Vatican Archives, list meetings, interrogations, and pastoral warnings issued to followers of the Cathar and Waldensian movements in southern France. Each entry names the accused, their place of origin, the date of denunciation, and the penances imposed ranging from public scourging to lifelong imprisonment. As the medieval inquisitorial system developed under Pope Gregory IX in 1231, the archives absorbed regional records from Toulouse, Lombardy, and Sicily, creating a centralized index of heretics. Inquisitors recorded confessions extracted by oath-and, sometimes under duress, documenting doctrines deemed incompatible with Orthodox teaching, such as dualism or the rejection of sacraments. These registers also preserved correspondence between the papal curia and secular rulers, petitions requesting extradition of accused heretics, and reports of book burnings. When the Spanish Inquisition rose to prominence in the late 15th century, its meticulously kept archivoslator transferred to Rome added thousands of names, including crypto-Jews, Protestant sympathizers, and blasphemers whose private beliefs challenged social order. Even as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum catalogued heretical writings, these personal registers tracked living souls. In 1965, shortly after the Second Vatican Council, The Vatican formally revoked penalties against heresy, and many inquisitorial records were reclassified for historical research. Yet access remains tightly controlled. Scholars must request individual permissions to view the original parchment rolls, now kept under lock in climate-regulated vaults. As you study the faded ink of these registers, you confront the human cost of doctrinal uniformitia, ledger of judgment that transformed neighbors into suspects and private convictions into public crimes. Here, in these silent volumes, the archives reveal how the Church sought to map and master belief itself. In the hushed corridors of the Vatican Archives lies a curious anomaly: the burial file of Pope John XXIII, not the 20th century reformer, but a medieval pontiff whose funeral rites were deliberately erased. Within registers from the early 13th century, entries note how Cardinal Pietro of Albano died amid charges of simony and nepotism. Elected in secret as Pope Celestine V II, he reigned for barely 6 weeks before his fall from grace rendered him more liability than spiritual leader. The archives preserve fragments of his coronation bull, yet no funeral mass is recorded. Instead, scribes left a blank section in the necrology, with a terse annotation instructing successors to omit any mention of his passing. The omitted page survives only as a ghostly watermark on subsequent folios, a silent testament to canonical vengeance. Rumor holds that Celestine's body was interred in an unmarked grave within the Vatican gardens, far from the traditional resting places of his predecessors. In the late 15th century, when Pope Sixtus IV commissioned a renovation of the burial crypts, workers reported finding a rough-hewn coffin bearing a cardinal's hat but no inscription. Lacking any directive, they reburied the remains beneath a simple flagstone, and the record vanished once more. Modern-day archivists have stumbled upon marginal notes referring to a secret exhumation during the Avignon papacy, when rivals sought evidence to retroactively nullify his brief reign. Despite extensive searches, no official file documents that event. When historians petition for access to the chapter's necrology, they encounter an unusual redaction, a section that is physically cut out of the parchment. As you chart the empty space where Celestine's death should be, you confront a rare moment of institutional erasure, where memory itself was judged unworthy of preservation. In that absence, the archives reveal their own power to shape history by choosing which stories merit a final resting place. Hidden within specialized oak cabinets deep in the Vatican archives are the original case files of the Roman Inquisition, each volume bearing the subtle burn marks of candles used by inquisitors long ago. These meticulously bound dossiers document investigations into suspected heresy from the mid-16th century through the 18th century, when ecclesiastical courts wielded the tools of interrogation, penance, andat, times condemnation. The files open with letters of accusation, often anonymous, naming individuals who questioned transubstantiation, circulated forbidden texts, or spoke against clerical privilege. In the margins, inquisitors recorded witness testimonies, noting the exact wording of heretical statements and the identities of those who overheard them. Some volumes include daguerreotype-like sketches of alleged offenders, while others contain folded petitions from families pleading for leniency. As the Inquisition's procedures evolved, the archives received procedural manuals, handwritten guides on how to conduct examinations, how to administer the cautio oath, and when to escalate cases to the Supreme Congregation of the Holy Office. One particularly striking folder holds the transcript of an inquisitor's council meeting, where theologians debated the admissibility of dreams and visions as evidence. Though many scholars imagine the Inquisition of endless flames and ruthless torture, the archival reality reveals a complex legal system that offered multiple opportunities for confession, recantation, and reconciliation. Records show that clergy could appeal sentences, sometimes commuting harsh penalties to public penance or forced pilgrimage. The archives preserve post-trial insurance documents confirming that pardoned individuals were reintegrated into parish life and that their families received funds to restore honor. Yet the files also bear the weight of injustice. Names scratched out when informants were discredited, entire casebooks burned in periods of papal reform, and heavy seals marking volumes meant never to be opened. As you turn these pages, you trace the fine line between safeguarding orthodoxy and suppressing inquiry, and you confront the human faces behind doctrinal enforcement. In the Inquisition files, the Vatican Archives lay bare the Church's solemn duty to protect its flock and the frailty of power when wielded in the name of purity. Beneath the grandeur of papal lineage lies a tangled network of familial alliances, and tucked away in the Vatican Archives are genealogical charts and private correspondences that suggest several Renaissance popes fathered children whose existence was systematically concealed. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia ascended as Pope Alexander VI, and among his most guarded documents are letters exchanged with his children, Cesare and Lucrezia correspondence, that reveals his efforts to secure ecclesiastical benefices and political marriages under Vatican auspices. These letters, bound in crimson leather and sealed with the Borgia coat of arms, map out dowries, military commissions, and even secret visits beneath the apostolic palace. Similarly, the archives contain entries from the papal wardrobe accounts noting custom fittings for papal nephews, labeled Alumnus Francisci rather than nephew or offspring, ensuring official records never expose their true parentage. Beyond the Borgias, marginal notes in the diaries of Pope Paul III reference his daughter, Felice Peretti, though official necrologies list her only as a distant cousin. Vatican notaries recorded her lavish expenditures on palaces in Rome, documenting sums drawn from ecclesiastical revenues without specifying the familial relationship. In the private ledger of Pope Innocent VIII, historians discover ledger entries for children's pensions described as charitable disbursements. Yet, cross-referencing baptismal registers in the archives uncovers local parish entries matching the Pope's surname. These hidden bloodlines were perpetuated through the practice of appointing sons and nephews to cardinalships, military commands, and diplomatic roles positions requiring papal approval documented in appointment briefs, where careful wording obscures paternal links. Only by piecing together fragmented wills, baptismal certificates, and financial ledgers can researchers illuminate the human stories behind the office of Peter's successor. As you navigate these clandestine records, you confront the tension between spiritual authority and earthly allegiance, and you witness how the archives guard not only sacred doctrine, but also the secret ties that bound popes to their flesh and blood. In the waning days of September 1978, the sudden passing of Pope John Paul I sent shockwaves through the global Catholic community. And the Vatican Apostolic Archives hold the initial inquiries and internal memoranda that reveal just how swiftly whispers of conspiracy took root. Known affectionately as the Smiling Pope, Albino Luciani had occupied the papal throne for only 33 days when aides found his lifeless body in the papal apartments. Though the official account cited a fatal heart attack, the archives contain unsigned reports questioning procedural irregularities, delayed rounds by the papal physician, missing sections in the daily logs, and conflicting testimonies about who last saw the pontiff alive. Among the restricted files is a memorandum from the Master of Pontifical Liturgical Celebrations, noting that Vatican staff had struggled to locate the Pope's personal diary immediately after his death, only for it to reappear later with pages torn or obscured. A sealed envelope bearing the handwritten words, "Confidential, do not open," holds a short list of namescurial officials and members of the papal household whose interviews were conducted off the record. These interviews, documented in typewritten transcripts with erratic timestamps, raise as many questions as they answer, detailing hasty changes to security protocols and the transfer of papal papers to a private vault. Decades later, researchers gained limited access to photographic copies of these sensitive documents, revealing marginal annotations by Cardinal Jean Viot that hint at concerns over external pressures and factions at work, while subsequent investigations by Italian authorities found no evidence of foul play. The archives preserve every draft of police reports, autopsy submissions, and private letters exchanged among Vatican officials grappling with public grief and the burden of secrecy. As you pore over these meticulously catalogued yet censored papers, you confront the tension between pastoral care and institutional self-preservation. In these silent files, the sudden death of John Paul I remains a riddle woven into the fabric of Vatican history, reminder that even the most beloved pontiffs are not immune to the shadows cast by power. Hidden among the rows of parchment in the Vatican archives are fragments of early Christian texts that never made it into the New Testament canon, their content deemed too unsettling or theologically inconvenient for inclusion. These suppressed Gospels, written between the 2nd and 4th centuries, offer narratives of Jesus and the apostles that diverged sharply from orthodox teachings. In one collection, labeled Evangelia Abditae, scholars have identified portions of the Gospel of Mary, which portrays Mary Magdalene as a primary confidant of Christ, entrusted with secret revelations that the male disciples neither comprehend nor accept. Handwritten marginalia suggest that at a synod in Rome around 400, Church Fathers ordered these portions removed from circulation to preserve hierarchical authority. Similarly, fragments of the so-called Gospel of Thomas, a compilation of sayings attributed to Jesus, survive only because a handful of manuscripts were hidden beneath the floorboards of a desert monastery. The archives hold the Latin translations commissioned by Augustine, who annotated the texts to highlight what he called dangerous ambiguities that threatened doctrinal unity. A sealed folder contains correspondence between Pope Gelasius I and Bishop Epiphanius of Salamis, debating whether to burn these writings or bind them away from public view. By the 6th century, the majority of these non-canonical Gospels were collected, censored, and placed under the direct supervision of the prefect of the archives. When Constantine's successors promoted the established canon at Nicaea and Constantinople, the archives became the final repository for any divergent scripture, preserving them under strict seal. Modern researchers must apply for a papal brief, and often wait years for permission to study these fragile codices. As you examine ink faded by centuries, you encounter voices that challenged emerging orthodoxy questions about the nature of the soul, the role of women in the early church, and visions of a hidden, spiritual kingdom. In these suppressed writings, the archives reveal the complex process by which collective belief was shaped, enforced, and, in some cases, rewritten. A towering figure in both medieval history and collective imagination, Joan of Arc's fate was sealed in 1431 through the meticulous records now preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, where the original Latin transcripts of her trial stand as a stark testament to political maneuvering cloaked in religious pretext. Accused of heresy and sorcery by a tribunal convened under Bishop Pierre Cochonin, English ally, the 19 articles of indictment against Joan were drafted in Rouen with close oversight from the Archdiocese of Reims. The archives contain the petition from King Charles VII, requesting her condemnation and detailed minutes of the sessions held in a cold stone council chamber. Witness testimony, transcribed by clerks, describes Joan's insistence on visions from St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret, her donning of male attire, and her unwavering conviction that she served divine will. Marginal annotations by inquisitors reveal tension among the clerical judges, some of whom privately questioned the legality of convening a trial under secular authority. The documents also include Joan's own unswerving responses, recorded with precision, in which she refuses to renounce her voices or abandon her armor, even when threatened with dire punishment. Following her forced recantation, apparently uttered under duress, the archives preserve the solemn Ritter Protocol, the ceremony by which she publicly renounced her beliefs, only to retract her recantation the next morning in a prison cell. The final verdict, signed and sealed by Cochon, labeled her a relapsed heretic and delivered her into English custody for execution. On the day she was burned at the stake, the archives received an unsigned report describing the scene. Joan's calm composure as flames rose, her prayerful voice echoing in the square, and the profound silence that followed. Centuries later, Pope Calixtus III nullified the verdict in a retrial organized by the Church, but the original trial records remain under restricted seal, accessible only to scholars with papal briefs. As you pore over the yellowed parchment, and the ink still legible after nearly 600 years, you confront the complex interplay of faith, politics, and personal courage that defined Joan of Arc's journey from peasant girl to martyr and saint. Tucked within a reinforced chest in the deepest vaults of the Vatican archives is the Codex Romanus Exorcisticus, a prayer book so potent that its pages were long rumored to tremble at the touch of impure hands. Compiled in the early 17th century under Pope Urban VIII, this codex gathers every officially sanctioned exorcism ritual approved since the 13th century, including rites originally reserved for extraordinary cases of demonic possession. Bound in calfskin and secured with iron clasps, its vellum folios bear hand-painted illuminations of archangels confronting grotesque demons, while marginal annotations record the effectiveness or failure of each formula. Among these entries, one finds the so-called Greater Exorcism employed by St. Philip Neri, noted in a faded note as having expelled unseen spirits that tormented Rome's poor. Another section preserves a once-suppressed ritual attributed to Pope Leo X, later removed from public manuals because of its invocation of names drawn from Jewish and Islamic traditions. The archives also house the private correspondences of exorcists, who petitioned directly to the Pope for authorization to perform rites in remote dioceses, letters detailing tremors during ceremonies, and attestations by physicians who witnessed inexplicable cures. In the 18th century, elements of the Codex were recopied by Jesuit scholars, their Latin glosses debating permissible adaptations for emerging psychological theories. When the Ritual Romanum was standardized by Pope Paul V, select passages from the Codex were omitted entries, subsequently blacked out in surviving copies. Today, scholars seeking to study the original version must gain special permission from the prefect of the archives and work under the supervision of a consultant appointed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. As you turn these heavy pages, you confront the thin boundary between faith and fear, where prayer becomes a weapon and words claim power over unseen realms. In the Codex of Exorcisms, the Vatican Archives reveal how an institution confronted the darkest corners of belief by preserving the rites meant to reclaim lost souls. Deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archives lies a volume embossed with the papal seal and labeled Register of Judiorum Tributorum, containing centuries of financial records that detail the Church's oversight of Jewish communities across Europe. From medieval ghettos to Renaissance banking centers, these ledgers record levies, exemptions, and petitions for relief granted or denied by successive popes. One section notes a correspondence from the Jewish community of Rome in 1555, appealing to Pope Paul IV to reduce their census tax after plague had decimated local families. The response, preserved on vellum, grudgingly offered a temporary reprieve in exchange for a lump sum payment that further impoverished the remaining households. Elsewhere, the archives hold detailed roll calls of taxable adults in Venice, Florence, and Ancona, with marginal annotations marking those who converted under duress or fled to Ottoman territories. In 1581, under Gregory XIII, additional columns were added to track conversos and to calculate supplemental levies on those suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. These records, handwritten in a precise chancery hand, also include rare petitions from Jewish women widows, often the sole breadwinners pleading for leniency after their husband's passing. Later entries from the 17th century reflect the shifting geopolitical landscape, as former papal states ceded territory to secular princes who assumed responsibility for collecting these taxes. The archives preserve cessations of obligation, letters of transfer, and even disputes over jurisdiction that reach the desks of popes and cardinals. While modern scholarship often focuses on theological debates, these fiscal documents expose a more intimate narrative of survival, coercion, and resilience. They reveal how the Church wielded financial pressure to enforce conversion and how Jewish communities navigated a precarious existence under ecclesiastical authority. As you examine the cramped columns and faded ink, you confront the lived reality of religious minorities subject to spiritual oversight and temporal demands. In the Jewish tax records, the Vatican Archives unearth a ledger of human endurance, where every entry represents lives shaped by faith, fear, and the quest for mercy. Beneath the veneer of ecclesiastical ceremony, the Vatican's financial dealings in mid-20th century Italy intersected with underworld networks convergence, documented in confidential banking records stored within the Vatican Apostolic Archives. In the early 1950s, as post-war reconstructions swelled Rome's real estate market, the Vatican Bank, formerly the Institute for the Works of Religion, expanded its mortgage portfolio, purchasing properties in suburban districts where local entrepreneurs held sway. The archives preserve transaction ledgers showing large cash deposits from shell companies later traced to known mafia figures in Sicily and Calabria. Entries annotated with coded references, Project Alpha, or Fund B. A 1,959 memorandum from the bank's auditor, found in a sealed folder, flagged irregular withdrawals in Palermo and noted client identities omitted for confidentiality. Subsequent correspondence between the bank's prelate directors and their lay administrators reveals tense debates over whether to demand transparency or maintain discretion to protect Vatican interests. In 1963, when Italian magistrates launched Operation Palermo to investigate money laundering, the archives received copies of indictments and requests for cooperation. Internal files show that the Vatican chose to provide limited assistance, citing sovereign immunity and banking secrecy. Still, a trove of letters dated 1965 details clandestine meetings between clerical officials and intermediaries offering favors in exchange for continued privacy. Though later Vatican reforms under Pope Paul VI tightened oversight, resulting in the removal of several bank executives, these archival documents remain sealed, their existence acknowledged only through indirect references in reform decrees. Today, researchers granted partial access find redacted passages and footnotes warning that disclosure could harm diplomatic relations. As you trace the inked entries linking holy institutions to criminal networks, you confront a world where spiritual mission and worldly power collided. In the Vatican and the Mafia files, the archives lay bare the uncomfortable truth that money, like influence, can flow through the unlikeliest channel sand, that safeguarding the Church's temporal assets sometimes meant negotiating with shadows. When the records of papal succession are examined closely, a corner of history reveals a ghostly figure, Benedict, whose brief and contested reign was all but erased, yet traces of his papacy survive in the Vatican archives, under the entry Benedictus X, Electus Romanae Sedis, elected by a faction of Roman nobility after the death of Pope Stephen IX. Benedict's installment incited outrage among reformist cardinals who had been excluded from the electoral process. His papal bull Inceptio, though authenticated by the cardinal deacons, was swiftly denounced by a rival assembly convened by Hildebrand of Sovana, the future Gregory VII, who questioned the legality of the election and launched a counter-synod to depose him. The archives preserve correspondence between Benedict and the imperial court of Emperor Henry III, in which the Pope-elect pledges fealty and asks for enforcement of his authority in Rome. Yet, within months, the tide turned. Royal envoys secured support for Hildebrand's claim, and Benedict found himself besieged in Castel Sant'Angelo. His bulls and decrees were formally rescinded at a Lateran council, and the archive's custody notes record the collection and cancellation of his papal regalia. Curiously, the necrology, the official register of papal deaths, omits his retreat into obscurity, noting only a monk named John of Savona, who died in exile. Further intrigue lies in a fragmentary diary of a 12th century Vatican notary, whose marginal scribbles reference a secret clause in Benedict's resignation oath, whereby he vowed never to assert his claim again. That parchment, cut from the main docket, survives only as a backing sheet glued to later conservation reports. When Benedict X died quietly in 1068, the archives received word of his passing through a brief wire from the Abbey of Grottaferrata, yet no funeral record was drawn up in the papal canon. Modern scholars who petitioned for access to the resignation and excommunication folder find pages redacted to conceal the precise terms of his forced abdication. As you examine these ghostly entries sync that seems to fade where his name once stood, you confront a rare instance of institutional erasure, where a pope was both made and unmade by competing forces of power, reform, and memory. In a dimly lit chamber deep within the apostolic palace, the College of Cardinals convened in what should have been a decisive conclave to elect a new pope, yet no record of its conclusion exists in the Vatican archives. Following the death of Pope Honorius II, tensions between Italian and Northern European cardinals reached a fever pitch. As the cardinals gathered, rival factions blocked one another's electorates, leading to a stalemate that stretched for weeks. Contemporary letters preserved in private collections outside Rome hint at emissaries dispatched to negotiate compromise, but the Vatican's official registers fall silent after the initial opening Mass. An obscure notation in the 1155 necrology lists only sedentes Romani, those who sat in Rome without naming any successor. Later archival inventories note a gap in the series of papal bulls, as if an intervening pontificate were intentionally omitted. Some historians theorize that a deeply divisive candidate may have been elected but forced to resign before consecration, his brief claim deemed too controversial to record. A forged bull, dated to that period, discovered among the archive's forgeries folder, bears a plausible papal signature, but carries internal inconsistencies in dating and protocol, suggesting an attempt to retroactively legitimize a hidden election. Marginal annotations by Inquisitor Robertus reveal that inquiries made during a subsequent pontificate uncovered fragments of a forced abdication oath, but lacked supporting testimony to confirm details. When Pope Adrian IV later reorganized the archives, he ordered that any documents related to this conclave be sealed, lest discord find new life in the hearts of the faithful. Today, scholars probing the archive's catalog encounter references to Archivum Conclavis, but are redirected to sealed collections, with access granted only by direct papal mandate. Standing before the empty shelf where those records should be, you sense the weight of unanswered questions. Did ambition eclipse faith? Did fear of schism prompt deliberate erasure? In the silence of that forgotten conclave, the archives withhold a lesson about the fragility of consensus and the power of memory to shape the papacy. Within a heavy iron-bound chest in the depths of the Vatican Apostolic Archives lies a manuscript known colloquially among archivists as the Borgia poison log, a ledger of alleged assassination plots and clandestine poisonings linked to the notorious Borgia family. Commissioned in secret by Pope Alexander VI and compiled by his trusted chamberlain, this document records entries detailing the delivery of toxic substances to rival cardinals, foreign ambassadors, and even disloyal members of the papal household. Each entry is dated according to the Roman calendar and written in a spidery chancery hand, with marginal notes indicating whether the target succumbed quickly or lingered in agonizing decline. In one passage, a substance derived from wolfsbane and nightshade was smuggled into a cardinal's wine casket. The ledger notes victima mortua post triduum. Yet questions linger about the speed of the demise. Elsewhere, the log describes an aborted attempt to eliminate a king's envoy through contaminated pastry. The effort halted when the diplomat's servant fell ill instead. Although later editions of the archive's catalog omit this volume from public finding aids, the original survives under lock and key, its vellum pages yellowed and stained. A single replacement leaf in the codex bears the papal seal, suggesting that at least one entry was removed or replaced after the death of Cesare Borgia in 1507. Scholars granted conditional viewing have reported discovering faint underdrawings beneath the ink, possibly drafts of alternative plots abandoned in haste. The existence of this log confirms the darker rumors that surrounded the Borgias, revealing how ambition and fear of betrayal could lead even the highest office in Christendom into the shadows of murder. As you unfurl these damning pages, you confront a Vatican willing to employ poison as a political weapon and an archive determined to preserve the scars of its own complicity. Beneath the guise of pastoral outreach, the Vatican maintained an intricate intelligence apparatus whose activities are documented in clandestine files within the Apostolic Archives. During the pontificate of Pope Pius XI, reports from Vatican diplomats reveal systematic gathering of political and social intelligence across Europe and Latin America. A particularly sensitive dossier labeled Operatio Custos contains coded dispatches from nuncios in Berlin, Madrid, and Buenos Aires, alerting the Holy See to anti-clerical legislation, clerical imprisonments, and revolutionary movements. These dispatches, often written on stationery bearing only an embossed tiara and keys, were routed through the Secretariat of State to a small cell of prelates and lay experts charged with analyzing their contents. Marginal annotations in one report from 1936 note that Spanish bishops were under surveillance and that papal envoys quietly funded underground networks to smuggle priests out of Republican territory. Similar files from World War II detail how the Vatican intercepted encrypted communications between Axis powers and local fascist regimes, then discreetly relayed humanitarian aid routes for Jews and dissidents seeking refuge in church-run safe houses. Even after the war, as Cold War tensions rose, Vatican-mounted listening posts monitored communist bloc broadcasts and cultivated contacts in Eastern Europe. When Pope Paul VI reformed the Secretariat in 1965, many of these espionage files were reclassified under diplomatic intelligence and sealed, with access restricted to successive prefects of the archives and a handful of trusted consultants. Today, researchers petitioning for these records find only references to depositi reservati and must obtain a direct mandate from the current pope. As you examine the faded codebooks, cipher keys, and encoded telegrams, you confront a Vatican that saw itself not only as spiritual leader, but as guardian of a global flock willing to embrace covert means in service of preserving faith communities and influencing geopolitical outcomes. In these hidden pages, the archives reveal how diplomacy and doctrine intertwined with the shadowy world of intelligence, shaping the Church's role on the world stage. Deep within the Vatican archives, locked behind 3 iron keys and guarded by Vatican police, rests the so-called Grand Grimoire Compendium of rituals and incantations deemed too perilous for ordinary clerics to possess. Compiled in the late 15th century by a circle of scholars under papal commission, this grimoire gathers esoteric knowledge drawn from Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic alchemy, and pre-Christian European folk magic, all annotated with corrective glosses to align its content with church doctrine. The volume's vellum leaves are covered in dense Latin script, illustrated with diagrams of planetary sigils and pentacles, alongside prayers that invoke angelic names once excised from public liturgical books. Marginal notes indicate which rites received papal approval for exorcisms, and which were condemned as demonic conjurations. In the early 17th century, when Pope Urban VIII ordered the standard Ritual Romanum, he personally reviewed sections of the grimoire to extract approved exorcistic formulas, leaving behind cancelled passages marked with black ink and the annotation Prohibitum. The archives preserve both the excisions and the full original text in separate binders, ensuring scholars can trace how authorized ritual evolved from forbidden lore. A hidden appendix describes the preparation of consecrated oils and perfumes used to sanctify places afflicted by malign spirits recipes that later found their way into official sacramentals after careful redaction. When entries in the grimoire contradicted established theology, they were relegated to an inner trove, accessible only to the prefect of the archives and 2 theological consultants appointed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Rare scholars granted conditional access have reported faint fingerprints on certain pages, suggesting they were consulted under clandestine circumstances. As you turn the weighty folios and follow the intertwining of faith and fear, you encounter a church simultaneously wary of and indebted to the very powers it sought to contain. In the Grand Grimoire, the Vatican archives preserve an uncanny testament to how sacred authority has borrowed, battled, and ultimately harnessed the ancient arts in the service of spiritual guardianship. Tucked away in a slender folio bound in dark leather, the prophecy of Malachi survives in a single Latin manuscript preserved under seal in the Vatican Apostolic Archives, its contents shrouded in mystery and debate. Purportedly penned by Saint Malachi of Armagh in the 12th century and rediscovered by the Benedictine monk Arnold de Wyan in 1590, the prophecy assigns a cryptic motto or emblem to each future pope, ending abruptly after the reign of Urban VIII. The archives hold Wyan's own annotated copy, bearing his marginal glosses on the authenticity of each clause, and a competing transcript once owned by Cardinal Simoncelli that omits certain entries and rearranges mottos to align with known pontificates. A confidential memorandum from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith questions whether the prophecies are medieval forgeries or genuine divinations, noting linguistic inconsistencies and references to post-10th century symbols. Scholars granted conditional access have compared the manuscript's handwriting against other documents from the Abbey of Clairvaux, where Malachi served as abbot, finding no direct match yet. Phased by political intrigue in Rome during the Counter-Reformation, clerics may have suppressed earlier copies to avoid accusations of schism. Despite Vatican disclaimers that the prophecy holds no official status, archivists whisper of a second. Smaller codex, containing an epilogue in which Malachi purportedly warned of a final pontiff whose reign would presage the end of days. That epilogue remains inaccessible, its location known only to the prefect and 2 appointed consultants. The archive's conservation records show that the prophecy manuscript was microfilmed in 1922 under Pope Pius XI, yet the original folio was never returned to public shelves, instead sliding into the Reservatum Archivum, a category reserved for items too sensitive for general study. As you trace the neat script of each motto, from De Labore Solis to Petrus Romanus, you confront a document that has fueled papal speculations, conspiracies, and even wagers on succession, despite official denials of its significance. In the silent stacks, the prophecy of Malachi stands as a testament to how prophecy and power can entwine, and how an archive can both preserve and perpetuate the allure of an uncertain future. When Pope Clement V relocated the papal court to Avignon in 1309, he intended it as a temporary refuge from Roman turmoil, but in doing so he left behind a trove of documents now presumed missing. The Vatican Apostolic Archives include tenuous references to a cache of letters, financial ledgers, and diplomatic missives transferred to the Palais de Pape, yet no catalog survives detailing their contents. Surviving marginal notes in the Roman registers mention shipments of crates bound for the south of France, annotated with destination codes rather than descriptive titles. Box A3, Secretorum, for example, suggesting items too sensitive even for standard inventories. During the decades of the Avignon papacy, successive pontiffs generated reams of correspondence with French monarchs, Italian city-states, and the Holy Roman Emperor. But modern scholars find gaps when comparing Vatican holdings to those in regional archives. A confidential memo dated 1377, filed under Archivio Compromissorum, hints that Clement VI ordered the destruction of records implicating his predecessors in the enforcement of onerous taxes and the misappropriation of Crusader funds. French chroniclers later describe scenes of bonfires in the palace courtyard, where monks cast leather-bound volumes into roaring flames, though no official decree attests to this purge. When Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, attempts were made to retrieve the Avignon archives, but many crates never arrived or arrived emptied of their contents. The Vatican's own correspondence from that period laments missing seals and illegible packing notes, yet none of these retrieval efforts were documented in surviving ledgers. Today, researchers consulting the Archivum Apostolicum Secretum find references to Avignon materials locked in a forgotten sub-collection, only reachable by a papal mandate and a sworn oath of silence. As you examine the empty shelf labeled Archivium Avignonense, you confront one of the greatest archival mysteries of the medieval church, the deliberate or inadvertent erasure of a generation's worth of records, leaving behind questions about memory, authority, and the fragility of institutional transparency. Amid the upheaval of the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Vatican found itself negotiating survival with a conqueror whose ambitions reshaped Europe's map. In the Apostolic Archives, correspondence between Cardinal Consalvi, Secretary of State, under Pope Pius VIII, Napoleon's envoys reveals a delicate dance of concession and conviction. Initial letters exchanged in 1801 discuss the reinstatement of church property confiscated during the revolutionary dechristianization campaigns, with Consalvi carefully wording petitions to restore dioceses, while acquiescing to the new secular regime. A draft concordat, dated June of that year, penned in Napoleon's hand, offers imperial recognition of Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, in return for state control over bishop nominations and clergy salaries details outlined in microfilm, copies now kept under seal. Marginal annotations by Consalvi express relief that the cross may again stand in French churches, yet also betray concern over lay investiture powers granted to the state. Subsequent memoranda record tense negotiations over papal symbols. Napoleon insisted that the papal tiara be represented only in stylized form on French coins, while the Pope refused outright demands to rescind papal immunities for clergy accused of treason. When Pius VII traveled to Paris in 1804 for Napoleon's coronation, the archives hold the rare blue-bound folders containing preparations for the Pope's speech drafted in Latin, but secretly annotated to convey displeasure at being placed beneath the imperial crown. After relations soured and the Pope's brief imprisonment at Savona, the Vatican received coded telegrams from Bonaparte demanding further concessions, only to have Consalvi respond with a formal protest lodged in a sealed dispatch. These delicate exchanges, bound in diplomatic green vellum and sealed with both papal and imperial emblems, chart the contours of power between church and state. As you study the inked lines of agreement and dissent, you witness how the Vatican navigated a path between principled resistance and pragmatic diplomacy, striving to protect spiritual authority within the tempest of Napoleonic ambition. In the 15th century, as popes sought new revenue streams to fund grand architectural projects and maintain the sprawling administration of the Holy See, they turned to the sale of indulgences and papal pardons transactions documented in detailed financial ledgers now housed in the Vatican Apostolic Archives. These ledgers, bound in burgundy leather and stamped with the papal tiara, record fees paid by nobles, merchants, and commoners for remission of temporal penalties attached to sin. One entry from 1,472 notes, a payment of 100 ducats by a Florentine merchant who sought absolution for debts incurred during the Savonarolan riots, while another, from 1,502 lists, a reduced rate extended to a soldier returning from crusade. Marginal notations specify that certain plenary indulgences, granting complete remission, required not only monetary offerings, but also public acts of piety, such as funding a chapel or sponsoring a sermon series. The archives preserve private correspondences from papal nuncios in Germany, appealing for stricter enforcement of indulgence regulations in the wake of abuses that fueled early Protestant critiques. A secret memorandum by Cardinal Medici, dated 1515, complains that some local preachers were selling pardons at a discount or packaging multiple years of indulgence into a single certificate, undermining both revenue and ecclesiastical authority. These concerns culminated in the 1517 decree by Pope Leo X that standardized indulgence prices, though later entries show continued irregularities and complaints filed by bishops who felt their diocesan rights had been bypassed. When Martin Luther's 95 Theses challenged the practice, the archives received reports of rising dissent, with several certificates marked suspenso and stored in a quarantined chest. Today, scholars studying the original indulgence registers must petition for a papal brief, and even then, some pages remain sealed under Vatican privilege. As you examine the neat columns of names, dates, and sums paid, you confront a system where salvation became a commodity and where the quest for revenue shaped the very practice of forgiveness. In the sale of papal pardons, the Vatican Archives expose how economic necessity and spiritual aspiration intertwined in a pre-Reformation world. The Vatican's complex relationship with slavery is laid bare in a series of account books and diplomatic correspondence preserved within the Apostolic Archives. Though popes frequently issued moral condemnations of the enslaving of Christians, centuries of pragmatic compromise allowed the Church to profit indirectly from the Mediterranean and Atlantic slave trades. In one ledger entry from 1530, the archives record a payment of tribute from the Ottoman Bey of Algiers, granting safe passage to Christian captives in exchange for a share of proceeds from enslaved Muslims. Similar documents show agreements with Portuguese crown officials. A 1580 contract signed by King Sebastian stipulates that a portion of enslaved Africans brought to Lisbon would be delivered to the Vatican as tribute of souls, later sold at auction to fund papal hospitals. Private letters between Jesuit missionaries in Brazil and the Roman Curia dated 1645 and bound in crimson vellum detail instructions on baptizing enslaved natives and Africans, yet also note the missionaries' requests for funds derived from slave sale proceeds to build local churches. A summary report drafted for Pope Innocent XII in 1690 carefully condemns inhuman traffic, yet the accompanying financial statements reveal continued receipts from bishops' estates in the Caribbean. In the late 18th century, when the Enlightenment spurred abolitionist thought, the archives contain petitions by clerics urging the popes to end all involvement in slavery. These are catalogued beside income reports, showing that discontinuing slave-derived revenue would bankrupt charitable foundations in Rome. When Pope Gregory XVI formally denounced the slave trade in 1839, his allocution survives in draft form, alongside ledgers indicating residual sales of enslaved persons in Malta transactions. The Vatican continued to record until the mid-19th century. As you examine these juxtaposed moral and monetary records, you confront an institution wrestling with conscience, tradition, and fiscal survival. In the Vatican's slave trade files, the archives reveal how the pursuit of charity and the practice of exploitation were, at times, advocates and adversaries under the same seal. Among the dimly lit alcoves of the Vatican archives sits a narrow drawer marked Silvestri III, which contains an eerie bundle of documents recounting the occult interests of Pope Sylvester III, pious reformer whose legacy was overshadowed by rumors of forbidden alchemy. Elected in 1045 amid factional strife, John of Sabina assumed the name Sylvester III, but reigned for scarcely 2 weeks before being deposed and exiled. Centuries later, curial scholars uncovered fragments of his personal journal hidden in the margins of official registers. Detailed recipes for tinctures made from crushed gemstones and notes on experiments to transmute base metals into silver. Bound in vellum and smelling faintly of sulfur, the journal includes cryptic shorthand that scholars believe was intended to conceal the locations of secret laboratories beneath the Lateran Palace. Alongside these pages are letters addressed to an enigmatic figure known only as Magister Aurelianus, requesting ingredients such as mandrake root, scorpion claws, and distilled human blood requests that bear the unmistakable seal of Sylvester III's personal chancellery. A subsequent memorandum by Inquisitor Peter Damian, dated 1052, orders the immediate confiscation and destruction of any remaining alchemical equipment, citing the risk of demonic incursion. Archaeological reports filed under the Archives Conservation Department describe the 1954 discovery of an underground chamber near St. John Lateran containing lead-lined cauldrons and broken retorts remnants, believed to be those ordered destroyed nearly 9 centuries earlier. These materials were promptly sealed and hidden among unrelated architectural surveys. Modern access to the Sylvester III files requires a special dispensation, and only scanned facsimiles of select pages are available for study. As you pore over the faded ink and decipher arcane terms like aqua vitae and lumen siderum, you confront a pope who straddled the line between theological devotion and the ancient craft of transformation. In The Ghost of Pope Sylvester, the Vatican Archives reveal a chapter of ecclesiastical history where faith, science, and superstition coexisted in a fragile, hidden alchemy. In the lower stacks of the Vatican Archives lies a sealed dossier containing baptismal registers from the late 19th century, with an entry for Clara Pelsladolf Hitler's mother that bears an asterisk rather than the usual parish notation. Although the baptism took place in Fischlum, Austria, correspondence between the local pastor and the papal nuncio in Vienna, preserved in the archives, requests clarification of Clara's legitimacy and social standing. Marginal comments suggest uncertainty about her parentage, prompting the nuncio to forward her file for review by the Sacred Congregation of the Index. A confidential letter from 1,886 notes that the family's application for godparents was subject to an investigation into their political affiliations, reflecting the Church's wariness of burgeoning nationalist movements. The dossier also includes a copy of Clara's baptismal certificate stamped with the Vatican seal, alongside annotations indicating that it remains off-limits to researchers without explicit permission from the prefect of the archives. Although the Vatican officially maintains that Clara was baptized like any other Catholic child, these restricted records fuel speculation about the Church's knowledge of the family's future infamy. As you study the delicate ink of the baptismal register and the accompanying ecclesiastical correspondence, you confront a moment when ordinary sacrament intersected with the origins of a figure whose life would cast a shadow over the 20th century. In this hidden file, the archives remind us that even the most routine rites can carry unforeseen historical weight. Behind an unassuming door in the Vatican archives lies a chamber infrequently open to researchers, and known only as the Mortis Imago, or Death Mask Room. Within its stone walls rest plaster casts of countless popes' visages captured immediately after death casts, taken to preserve their features for posterity, long before the advent of photography. The room's key, kept by the prefect of the archives, unlocks a recessed niche where oak shelves bear urns and wooden boxes inscribed with pontifical names dating from the 14th century onward. Accompanying each mask is a fragile vellum envelope containing brief notes, the date of death, the cause as recorded by the papal physician, and, in some cases, the last words murmured by the pontiff. Among these is the mask of Pope John XXIII, taken in 1963, gentle, weathered features capturing the warm smile that earned him his epithet. Yet, in older masks, one discerns faces frozen in agony, their mouths open as if in eternal cry, a haunting testament to the burdens of office. The archives hold detailed protocols for mask-making drafted under Pope Innocent VIII in 1492, instructions on applying a protective layer of cloth to soften the plaster, and notes on preserving hair and beard stubble within the cast for authenticity. Following the Western Schism, when rival claimants to the papacy died in quick succession, several masks were mislabeled or mixed, leading 18th century curators to insert handwritten corrections in faded brown ink. In 1828, a fire in a nearby wing threatened the death mask room, and workers reported hearing faint cracking sounds from within, though no masks were lost. The charred fragments of a 1,378 masconce, believed to be Urban VI, were meticulously reassembled and remain on display beneath glass, its fractured stare a silent witness to ecclesiastical conflict. Access to this room remains tightly controlled. Only one scholar is admitted at a time, under the watchful eye of a conservator. As you step inside, the cool air carries a stillness broken only by the soft echo of your footsteps. In these silent likenesses, the archives confront you with the humanity of those who once claimed divine authority, and remind us that death is the great equalizer, imprinting every leader with the same mortal features. In the late autumn of 1777, a sudden blaze tore through a wing of the Vatican Palace adjacent to the Apostolic Archives, consuming centuries of documents before the Vatican fire brigades could contain the inferno. An eyewitness report filed by the papal chamberlain describes how flickering orange light first appeared just after midnight, sending archivists and servants scrambling to salvage sacred volumes. The archive's own incident dossier, preserved under restricted access, includes rough sketches of the conflagration's spread and lists of lost material-seerly medieval charters, private correspondences of Renaissance popes, and fragile illuminated manuscripts detailing 7th century liturgical rites. Among the irretrievable treasures was a collection of papyrus scrolls from the pontificate of Gregory the Great, their carbonized fragments later discovered in the debris and transferred to the Vatican's conservation laboratory, where a handful of letters could be partially unrolled and deciphered. Investigation files record an inquiry convened by Pope Pius VI, who commissioned a forensic review that concluded the fire originated in a corridor lined with old wax candles, yet marginal notes hint at suspicion of arson motivated by internal power struggles. A secret memorandum by a senior archivist mentions anonymously delivered threats, demanding the removal of certain files related to financial irregularities in the Papal States. In the aftermath, preservation protocols were overhauled, iron doors were installed, parchment was transferred to fire, resistant chests and replicas via early microfilm techniques were commissioned. The archives retain detailed logs of these reform measures and a post-fire catalog of recovered items, with annotations on the degree of damage: charred edge, ink smudged, or rendered illegible. Despite these safeguards, the loss of original documents from the 8th to the 13th centuries created gaps that scholars still attempt to fill through secondary sources. As you pore over the fire-scarred fragments and the reform decrees that followed, you confront the fragility of memory and the lengths to which an institution will go to protect its heritage. In the smoldering remains of the archive fire of 1000, 777, the Vatican Archives remind us that every document rescued from the flames is a testament to resilience and the relentless pursuit of preservation in the face of destruction. In the 15th century, the cult of Saint Verena of Viterbo blossomed across central Italy, her feast days celebrated with candlelit processions and miraculous healings. Yet, when historians in the Vatican Apostolic Archives began examining hagiographical collections in the early 1800s, they uncovered a startling truth: no contemporary medieval records, no baptismal registers, no ecclesiastical correspondence, no tomb inscriptions mentioned her existence before the late 14th century. Among the archive's manuscripts is a dossier labeled Verena Legendarium, comprising 4 versions of her life story, each more embellished than the last. The earliest text, copied around 1382, portrays Verena as a young peasant who tended to plague victims and raise the dead, her miracles recorded in glowing Latin poetry. Subsequent revisions, bound together in a crimson codex, introduce royal patrons, visions of angels, and a dramatic martyrdom elements absent from the initial account. Marginal notes by a 17th century archivist, Giovanni della Croce, express skepticism. He underlined references to kingdoms that existed only in legend, and questioned how Verena's supposed relics could have vanished without leaving a trace. In the archive's private correspondence files, letters from local Italian bishops plead with the Vatican to sanction Verena's canonization, only to have their petitions returned with requests for verifiable evidence. During the Council of Trent, an inquiry into popular devotions flagged Verena's cult as exemplary of unregulated sainthood yet. Intriguingly, the archives hold no formal decree condemning her veneration. Instead, her legend gradually faded, preserved in folk memory, but omitted from the official Roman martyrology. Today, scholars granted limited access find only secondary references, a mention in a 1594 papal almanac, and a single line in a 17th century sacramentary that lists her among blesseds, without offering proof of her beatification. As you leaf through the patchwork of texts in the Verena dossier, you confront the power of narrative to create sanctity and the Church's cautious stance toward unsanctioned devotion. In the tale of the saint who was never real, the archives reveal a delicate balance between popular faith and institutional authority, where even miracles must withstand the scrutiny of history. Behind a false wall in the Vatican archives lies a door marked simply Cartographia, concealing a secret chamber where ancient maps and atlases deemed politically sensitive were sequestered. These documents chart not only the known world, but also disputed borders and suppressed territories regions the Church preferred to keep off public charts. Inside, oak cabinets hold portolan charts from the 14th and 15th centuries, their vellum surfaces annotated in Latin and Venetian dialect, showing early Portuguese voyages along the West African coast. One large map, censored in public copies, labels territories under Ottoman rule as Terrae Saracenorum, its marginal gloss warning that knowledge of safe passages could embolden these rivals. Another atlas, produced by a Jesuit cartographer in 1621, depicts the New World with detailed inlets and river systems that undermined Spanish claims to exclusive rights, a map quietly removed from publications by order of the Secretariat of State. Interleaved among these are regional schemata of ecclesiastical jurisdictions, including lists of bishoprics later abolished or reassigned to avoid conflict with secular princes. A sealed folder contains correspondence between mapmakers and papal librarians, pleading for discretion when sharing charts with envoys from England and France. Annotations in iron gall ink record, which editions were deemed public, and which were relegated to the forbidden map room. In the 18th century, when the archives were reorganized, these maps were transferred to climate-controlled storage. Yet some atlases still show signs of water damage from a leak that went unreported for decades. Today, scholars wishing to consult the forbidden maps must request a special permit from the prefect and work under supervision to prevent duplication. As you unroll these folded treasures, you confront the intersection of geography and authority, and you witness how knowledge of the world's shape could influence the Church's diplomatic leverage. In the Forbidden Map Room, the Vatican Archives reveal that cartography was as much a tool of power as a reflection of discovery. In the cavernous crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica, a heavily guarded file in the Vatican Archives recounts the harrowing last moments of Pope Benedict IX, whose final hours were recorded in a dispatch never meant for public eyes. Having ascended the papal throne thrice amid scandal and intrigue in the mid-11th century, Benedict's tumultuous career culminated in exile to Germany, where he spent his last years in penance. Yet archival minutes of his deathbed vigil, penned by a Benedictine monk assigned by the Pope himself, describe a horrifying scene. Benedict, frail and delirious, suddenly screamed that demons clawed at my soul, convulsed violently, and collapsed with a final blood-curdling shriek. The monk's private report, bound in chipped oak and sealed with the abbot's signet, was forwarded directly to the prefect of the archives, with instructions that it remain off-limits to all but successive popes. Later, annotations by Cardinal Humbert note that the medical details mentions of fever, headache, and involuntary spasms were redacted from any official papal necrology to avoid igniting fears of demonic possession within the faithful. When scholars in the 19th century petitioned for access to Benedict's dossier, they discovered that the deathbed report had been removed and replaced with a brief statement citing a natural passing in his sleep. The original dispatch survives only because a single parchment fragment was inadvertently used as a binding reinforcement for an unrelated charter in 1124. This fragment, discovered during a 1958 conservation effort, bears the monk's trembling script and the faded words, "He screamed into the night." As you examine this recovered scrap, you confront the Vatican's delicate balance between spiritual reassurance and the unsettling reality of human mortality. In the file of the Pope who died screaming, the archives preserve a moment of raw terror that reveals both the vulnerability of those who claimed divine authority and the lengths an institution will go to shield its image from fear. Buried in the Vatican archives under the code Cardinalium Feminarum, a collection of diplomatic letters and ceremonial records hints at a time when women known by titles such as Cardinalin or Cardinalicia briefly held ranks equivalent to cardinal in certain medieval courts. These anomalous entries appear in 16th century correspondence between Pope Leo X's Curia and the court of Navarre, where Queen Jean III styled her chief advisor, Maria de Molina, as Cardinal of Pamplona. Although no formal bull ratifying this appointment survives, the archives contain John Cantacusine's dispatch praising her voice in the consistory and noting that she sat beside prelates during debates over regional synods. Similar cases emerge in the archives of Portugal, where King Manuel I allegedly urged Pope Julius II to grant his sister, Isabel of Coimbra, the Red Galero and a seat in the College of Cardinals in recognition of her diplomatic acumen. The Vatican's reply sealed with the Pope's signature referred only to honorary privileges, omitting explicit mention of office. In a private register of the Secretariat of Briefs, a Latin marginal note records a request to insert ella, she, alongside il, he, in the installation formula change later struck through in red ink. A codicil to the papal chancery hierarchy, found tucked inside a volume of 15th century ceremonial protocols, lists cardinalists among guests entitled to be received before ambassadors, yet subsequent editions excise the term entirely. When scholars in the 1920s petitioned the prefect for clarification, they received a terse response indicating that no woman has ever been fully invested with the cardinalate, though permalinks to the original passages remain in the archive's confidential concordance index. As you study these elusive references, you confront an intriguing tension between tradition and exceptional circumstance, and you witness how the archives preserve echoes of possibilities that were acknowledged, then carefully obscured. In the story of the female cardinals, the Vatican archives ask us to consider how authority and precedent can be both inclusive and exclusionary, and how the margins of history sometimes reveal more than its official center. Within a thick folio labeled Anatomica Secretorum in the Vatican archives lie finely executed anatomical drawings created by Renaissance monks who dared to study the human body in the cloister's hidden scriptorium. These sketches veins mapped in red ink, skeletal structures rendered in charcoal, and muscle layers meticulously overlaid were copied from confiscated dissections performed at Padua and Bologna, places renowned for their medical schools. Although the Church publicly discouraged the study of cadavers as contrary to the reverence due the human form, these images circulated privately among select theologians and physicians, seeking deeper insight into God's design. Marginal notes in Latin debate whether understanding bodily mechanics enhances or diminishes appreciation for the soul's divine spark. One particularly detailed plate, showing the heart's chambers and valves, bears a papal seal impressed in wax evidence that it was reviewed, if not entirely approved, by Rome's medical commission. A hidden register of permissions, now locked in a separate cabinet, records how Pope Sixtus IV granted restricted access to these sketches for the relief of suffering, while forbidding their inclusion in public teaching. When the Index Librorum Prohibitorum was enforced in 1559, copies of these anatomical plates were ordered destroyed. Yet, some survived because they had been rebound within liturgical manuscripts. In the 19th century, archivists discovered these concealed pages and transferred them to the archive's secure stacks, preserving them as part of the Church's intellectual heritage. Modern scholars who gain conditional access describe the visceral quality of the drawings, the palpable tension of sinew, and the surprising beauty of mortal flesh dissected for truth. As you unfurl these fragile sheets, you confront a moment when faith and science intertwined in uneasy partnership, and you witness how the Vatican Archives guard not only spiritual dogma, but also the anatomical revelations that challenged medieval taboos. Hidden within a vault marked Sigillum Vacantis in the Vatican Archives lies a slender scroll inscribed with a decree so confidential that it remains sealed beneath a leaden papal seal never to be opened until a future event that has yet to occur. According to internal memoranda preserved alongside the scroll, Pope Innocent III in the early 13th century commissioned this document to safeguard instructions for a crisis that threatened the very existence of the Holy See. The archives hold planning notes that refer to Condition X, an unspecified emergency requiring the temporary suspension of standard procedures for the election of a new pope. Under the terms of the sealed decree, the College of Cardinals would convene not in the Sistine Chapel, but in a hidden location, guided by encrypted coordinates contained only on the unopened scroll. Marginal annotations in an accompanying journal suggest that this protocol was drafted during the Albigensian Crusade, when threats of schism and outside invasion loomed, though the exact nature of Condition X is never defined. Later entries from the 15th century record attempts by Pope Pius II to relocate the scroll to a more secure repository, fearing that its discovery could foment panic or be used by adversaries to manipulate papal succession. When scholars in the 20th century requested access, they were informed that the seal bears the combined signets of 5 successive popes, its key hidden among a handful of cardinals designated as custodes sigilli. The only surviving note about the seal's legend warns that breaking it prematurely would render its contents null. As you stand before the scroll's vault door, its iron hinges cool to the touch, you confront a ritual of authority preserved in anticipation rather than memory. In the papal seal that never opens, the Vatican Archives reveal a measure of foresight unclouded by Timean instruction penned long ago to guide a church through a trial yet to come, reminding us that some secrets are meant to wait for their moment. In a secure cabinet labeled Phenomena Inexplicata, the Vatican Apostolic Archives house a series of confidential reports compiled by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences detailing unexplained aerial observations from the 1950s through the 1970s. Originally filed under theology rather than meteorology, these dossiers began in 1958 when pilots flying Vatican-chartered aircraft over the Tyrrhenian Sea reported luminous disks that executed maneuvers defying conventional aerodynamics. Their testimonies were passed to the Academy's secretary, who recorded radar readings corroborating rapid accelerations and instantaneous stops. Marginal notes by Jesuit astronomer Father Paolo de Rossi question whether the phenomena might be manifestations of angelic host or undiscovered physical forces. In 1964, a confidential memorandum to Pope Paul VI summarized similar sightings reported by Swiss guards on night watch, accompanied by sketches of triangular craft emitting pulsating lights. The archives contain a sealed folder of correspondence between the Secretariat of State and the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book office, requesting intelligence sharing under Vatican secrecy protocols. Later entries from the early 1970s record an incident above Castel Gandolfo in which ground-based instruments briefly picked up anomalous energy signatures, prompting an inquiry into possible propulsion theories. Though the Vatican publicly encouraged scientific study, the files were ultimately classified reservatum privatum and withdrawn from general consultation, accessible only to a select committee of astrophysicists and theologians. As you review these meticulously catalogued reports, complete with pilot logs, radar traces, and theological reflections, you confront a church prepared to engage the unknown with both faith and reason. In the Vatican and the UFO files, the archives reveal how an institution steeped in ancient tradition confronted questions that might reshape humanity's understanding of the heavens. In June of 1983, 14-year-old Emanuela Orlandi vanished without a trace from Vatican City after attending a music lesson, and the Apostolic Archives hold a sealed investigative dossier that chronicles the baffling events that followed. The file begins with police reports from the Vatican Gendarmerie, whose officers noted that Emanuela's lightweight sandals were discovered near her trumpet case in the courtyard of the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy. Subsequent pages contain transcripts of interviews with fellow students and staff, all insisting they saw her board a white Renault at the academy gate. Marginal notes by the prefect of the archives reference letters from Emanuela's brother, sent directly to the Pope, pleading for the family's pain to be acknowledged, a gesture recorded in the archives, but kept confidential from the public. Among the more disturbing entries is a fax sent in 1997, claiming responsibility by a shadowy group demanding release of imprisoned militants, its authenticity still debated by Vatican officials. The dossier includes diplomatic cables from Italian magistrates seeking cooperation and documents a Vatican response that invoked sovereign immunity and limited information sharing. A separate folder comprises sworn statements by Vatican employees who recall a directive to refrain from commenting to the press and to direct all inquiries to a single spokesperson. Despite periodic openings of the case by Italian courts, the archive's own investigative notebooks remain locked under 7 security seals, each requiring the consent of a different Vatican department. When journalists and lawyers have petitioned for access, they receive redacted photocopies that omit sensitive personal data and entries marked top secret. As you sift through these fragments-faded forms, stamped envelopes, and cryptic annotations, you confront the enduring ambiguity of a disappearance that has haunted 2 generations. In the disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi files, the Vatican archives lay bare the tension between hospitality and jurisdiction, compassion and confidentiality, and reveal how a simple life can become entangled in forces that even the Church struggles to unravel. In a small, sealed envelope tucked into the Apostolic Archives' miscellaneous section lies a sorrowful record of Pope Victor IV's tragic end documents that chronicle an extraordinary act of spiritual despair. Victor, elected in 1159 amid the schism opposing Pope Alexander III, lived his final days under siege in the Lateran Palace as imperial forces withdrew support and cardinals abandoned his cause. The archives contain a brief but poignant letter from his personal chaplain, Father Anselm, dated June 20, 1164, describing how the pontiff, weakened by fever and grief, refused the last rites offered by a visiting Dominican friar. Anselm's report notes Victor's trembling hand firmly pushing aside the crucifix in his whispered confession that he felt unworthy of God's mercy after years of contention and exile. Later entries include The mortuary register, in which Victor's death is recorded tersely as extremae desperationis causa, rather than cardiacus ictus, the customary notation for a fatal illness. A separate dossier holds the friar's personal testimony, sealed by the prefect of the archives, recounting how Victor looked upon the crucifix with tears, yet declared that no prayer could restore his trust in the church he once led. Subsequent correspondence between the papal chamberlain and the curial physicians alludes to an autopsy that revealed no mortal woundedly signs of extreme emaciation and a fractured spirit. In the necrology that follows, Victor's name appears without a burial, Mass, marked instead by a modest funeral at night, attended only by loyal attendants. Modern historians who have petitioned for access to Anselm's complete testimony discover that several pages remain redacted, their ink darkened to conceal Victor's most anguished words. As you hold these fragile parchments, you confront a pope who, in his final hours, turned away from the very salvation he had once proclaimed, and you witness an institution's choice to preserve both his legacy and his despair in equal measure. In secret files of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, one finds a rare dossier detailing an exorcism performed on Pope Leo XIII's ceremony preserved under restricted seal and believed to have occurred in the pontiff's private chapel in the final years of the 19th century. Although publicly celebrated for his intellectual vigor and the encyclical Rerum Novarum, Leo's personal physician documented unexplained episodes of shivering and anguished whispers during the night of March 11. 1892. The archives contain the priest's notes from the rite, prayers drawn from the Rituale Romanum, incantations invoking St. Michael and St. Raphael, and the sprinkling of Paschal water consecrated during Holy Week. Marginal annotations record how the Pope, prostrate before the altar, recited the Lord's Prayer with great difficulty, his voice trembling at phrases that spoke of deliverance from evil. A subsequent report by the chief exorcist confirms that Leo displayed no outward sign of illness, prompting theological reflection on the possibility of spiritual assault rather than physical malady. The exorcist's private letter to Cardinal Rampolla, now bound in a separate archival folder, describes the Pope's relief when the final prayer was uttered, and a profound calm that followed so intense that Leo insisted on celebrating Mass himself at dawn, in defiance of protocol. Scholars accessing microfilm copies of these entries note that the documents were reclassified in 1914 under the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, with certain phrases blacked out to obscure references to demonic manifestations. In the centuries since, no other pope has undergone an officially recorded exorcism. Leo's case remains unique, straddling the boundary between clerical duty and personal vulnerability. As you review the meticulous prayers, the careful seals, and the hushed testimonies, you confront a moment when even the Vicar of Christ sought deliverance from forces unseen. In the exorcism of Pope Leo XIII, the archives reveal a church willing to wield its most ancient rites in defense of its highest shepherd. Concealed within a leather-bound folio in the Vatican Apostolic Archives is an illustrated manuscript known as the Geographia Inferni, or Jesuit Map of Hell, commissioned in the late 17th century by Father Athanasius Kircher and later refined by Jesuit cartographers under papal patronage. Far from Dante's poetic vision, This map presents a meticulously surveyed depiction of the underworld's geography-layered caverns, subterranean rivers, and demarcated regions reserved for distinct categories of sin. The archives preserve Kircher's original sketches, hand-drawn cross-sections, showing the descent from Entry Gate at the River Acheron down through 9 concentric rings, each labeled with Latin inscriptions, denoting sins from lascivia to homicidium. Marginal notes indicate debates among theologians about precise boundaries should usurers be cast into the same abyss as heretics, and reference papal bulls that authorize the map's use in seminary instruction. In a sealed correspondence between the prefect of the archives and the superior general of the Jesuits, dated 1695, concerns are raised that public exhibition might invite ridicule rather than reverence. Thus, the map was withdrawn from circulation and stored under lock. Subsequent entries show an aborted plan to reproduce the map in color for a 1732 theological conference, halted when the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith considered the vivid imagery potentially scandalous. Today, scholars who gain special access to the Carte Recondite collection describe the map's eerie precision. Penitent souls depicted as tiny figures wandering labyrinthine passages, demons sketched in charcoal looming over each circle, and a central pit marked nihil, where salvation yields to oblivion. As you unroll this heavy manuscript under the watchful eyes of a conservator, you confront a vision of divine judgment, rendered in cartographic detail, blend of faith, fear, and scholarly rigor. In the Jesuit map of hell, the Vatican Archives preserve an uncanny artifact where geography and eschatology converge, and where the boundaries of the known world extend into the mysteries of the afterlife. In a discrete folder labeled Missio Himalaya, the Vatican Apostolic Archives preserve the extraordinary records of a covert expedition to Tibet undertaken between 1921 and 1923 under the aegis of Pope Benedict XV. As European powers carved spheres of influence across Asia, the Holy See dispatched a small contingent of Jesuit missionaries and cartographers to establish contact with Tibetan clergy and ascertain whether a local church might thrive beyond colonial jurisdictions. Their correspondence, bound in saffron-colored vellum and stamped with both papal and Jesuit seals, details arduous crossings of the Himalaya small notebooks filled with daily altitudes, observations of monastic rituals, and sketches of remote chapels carved into cliff faces. Marginal notes by the expedition leader, Father Matteo Ricci Jr., record clandestine meetings with Buddhist lamas who hinted at shared beliefs in compassion and the salvation of souls, yet cautioned against proselytism in a land wary of foreign influence. The archives also hold encrypted dispatches to the Secretariat of State revealing concerns that French and British agents monitored the journey, fearing Vatican intentions to claim spiritual authority in contested regions. One letter describes how Ricci Jr. presented a hidden reliquary of St. Francis Xavier to a sympathetic Tibetan hierarch, hoping to foster goodwill. Another recounts the successful baptism of a young monk in secret ceremony beneath the Potala Palace. Despite these achievements, the mission concluded quietly when the Holy See, mindful of geopolitical sensitivities, issued a directive to suspend further outreach until diplomatic norms could be secured. An internal memorandum dated 1924 instructed archivists to classify all mission materials as top secret, accessible only to the prefect and a single consultor. As you examine these delicate journals and muted watercolors depicting prayer flags against snow-capped peaks, you confront a Vatican striving to expand its pastoral reach in a world of shifting empires. In the secret mission to Tibet, the archives reveal a chapter of ecclesiastical daring where faith, diplomacy, and cultural respect converged high above the bounds of Christendom. Nestled among the Vatican's more somber collections is a dossier titled Martyrs Pueris, documenting a series of child canonizations in the late Middle Ages that some historians believe were driven more by politics than genuine sanctity. These records include testimonies from local bishops in southern Italy who reported miracles attributed to children as young as 8 claims, ranging from the spontaneous healing of plague victims to levitation witnessed by multiple parishioners. The archives hold the original inquiry transcripts, bound in thin parchment and bearing the seal of Pope Urban V, which record interviews with alleged miracle witnesses. Marginal entries by inquisitors cast doubt on certain accounts' sewn notation questions why 3 separate investigators saw the same child miraculously unburned after being held over a brazier, while another wonders whether noble patrons urged speedy canonization to boost pilgrimage revenue. Correspondence between the papal chamberlain and the Franciscan minister general discusses concerns that popular devotion was outpacing doctrinal certainty, leading to rushed proceedings that bypassed theological review. An internal memo from 1385 quietly advises freezing further canonization processes until more rigorous verification could be established. Yet many of these child martyrs remain venerated in local calendars. When Renaissance reformers pressed for a standardized process, the dossier was flagged obsoletum, not abolished, but shelved. Modern scholars who examine these documents must contend with redacted sections, where passages describing the children's final words and bodily signs of sanctity are obscured to protect the Church's image. As you read these tender yet contested testimonies, you encounter the vulnerability of innocence leveraged for ecclesiastical prestige and the archive's role in preserving both devotion and its doubts. In the Child Martyrs dossier, the Vatican archives remind us that even the purest faith can become entangled in the complexities of power and profit. Hidden in the Vatican archives' special collections is a tiny book of hours bound in midnight blue velvet, its pages said to carry a curse that afflicted its owners with vivid nightmares and sudden misfortune. Commissioned in Bruges around 1487 by an anonymous patron, the manuscript contains exquisitely painted miniatures of the Virgin's life, interspersed with curious, marginal symbols-thorned crowns, bleeding hearts, and a recurring monogram that no archivist has definitively identified. When the archives acquired the book in 1732, a note by the prefect warns that its previous keepers all met tragic ends. One fell from a scaffold, another succumbed to a mysterious wasting illness. The dossier includes letters from 18th-century cardinals requesting the removal of the monogrammed pages and the replacement of certain prayers, only to have the Vatican librarian countermand the order, citing the book's historical value. Conservation reports from 1000 954 document efforts to neutralize supposed malefic ink using distilled holy water and ultraviolet treatment ritual, so intricate it required a team of archivists to chant protective psalms during the process. When scholars examine the book today, they find that some miniatures have been excised, their outlines still visible through the vellum, while redacted stanzas in the calendar hint at forbidden invocations against forces unseen. As you trace your finger along the illuminated borders where roses wilt and stars fade, you confront a manuscript that transcends prayer, blending devotion with dread. In the cursed Book of Hours, the Vatican Archives safeguard a relic of faith entangled with fear, revealing how the boundary between the sacred and the supernatural can blur in the flicker of candlelight. In a seldom discussed episode recorded in the Vatican Archives, Pope Honorius I became one of the few pontiffs to be posthumously excommunicated, a judgment preserved in a dossier labeled Anathema Honorius. Following the Third Council of Constantinople, 681, bishops gathered in Rome and Constantinople debated monothelitism, the doctrine asserting Christ had a single divine will. Honorius, who reigned from 625 until his death in 638, had corresponded with Patriarch Sergius I of Constantinople, urging moderation in condemning theological opinions, but inadvertently appearing to endorse monothelite ambiguity. The council's canons, transcribed into the archives in a codex bearing the seal of Pope Agatho, formally anathematized Honorius alongside other heretical figures, declaring his letters tainted by error. Among these treasured manuscripts is the handwritten sentence of excommunication, bound in red leather and stored in a locked cabinet, stating that Honorius's teaching had sown confusion in the vineyard of Christ. Marginalia by later popes reflect discomfort. One 8th century annotation advises that the excommunication concerns doctrine, not the office, while another recommends distancing Honorius's name from liturgical commemorations. The archives hold detailed correspondence between the papal secretary and the Patriarch of Constantinople, negotiating the precise language of the anathema, ensuring it condemned only his writings, not the papal office itself. Modern canon lawyers who study these records find no evidence that the excommunication was ever formally lifted, though succeeding pontiffs omitted Honorius from official diptychs lists recited in Mass. As you examine the faded ink of the anathema scroll and the council decrees that enshrined it, you confront a rare moment when doctrinal purity overrode reverence for the papal office. In the excommunication of a pope, the Vatican Archives remind us that even the highest earthly authority stands subject to the definitions of orthodoxy it once upheld. Hidden behind a reinforced oak door deep in the Vatican Archives is a chamber known as the Room of Eternal Confession. Its existence, recorded in a single memorandum, dated 1622, and subsequently cross-referenced in later vault inventories. According to that memorandum, Pope Gregory XV, concerned by the growing number of penitents arriving after hours, commissioned a private confession booth, fitted with an unbroken lattice of confessionals interlinked across 3 adjoining cells. The archives preserve the original architectural drawinga parchment sketch, showing confessionals oriented east-west, each connected by narrow passages so that penitents could move unseen from one stall to another, never retracing their steps. Marginal annotations by the supervising architect, a Capuchin friar, Note that the room's walls were lined with sound-absorbing tapestries to ensure that every whisper remained private. A sealed addendum to the drawing contains a list of reserved sins that only the Pope or his delegated bishop could absolve, including high-level crimes such as regicide, heresy, and violations of papal immunity. In 1694, under Innocent XII, an entry records that the room's locks were changed and the keys entrusted solely to the master of ceremonies, whose sworn oath forbade disclosure of the chamber's location. Subsequent conservation reports note that the confessionals were crafted from imported cypress wood, treated with aromatic oils intended to calm the penitent's nerves. When scholars petition for access, they must provide a detailed theological proposal and are escorted by 2 archivists. Once inside, they may observe but not enter, able only to study the 1,622 drawings through protective glass. As you trace the delicate lines and faded notes, you confront a space designed to cradle the gravest secrets of the faithful, a room whose very architecture embodies the Church's commitment to mercy wrapped in mystery. Tucked among the Vatican's most sensitive holdings is a ledger titled Acta Miraculorum Purganda, cataloging reported miracles later deemed insufficient for canonization. Compiled in the aftermath of the Council of Trent, this ledger lists dozens of cases from 1,560 to 1,580 healings attributed to relics, apparitions of saints, and visions of the Virgin Mary. Each case file includes affidavits from eyewitnesses, medical assessments by papal physicians, and theological evaluations by consultors of the Congregation of Rites. Marginal notes indicate which miracles were accepted, which were deferred, and which were outright rejected, often due to lack of corroboration or conflicting testimony. One entry describes a suspected cure of a child with convulsions that disappeared after the relic of St. Francis passed over her forehead, yet medical records note recurring symptoms weeks later, leading to a verdict of in conclusio. In several cases, the ledger records that local bishops lobbied for inclusion in official calendars, only to have their petitions returned with explanations citing procedural lapses, missing reports, unsigned statements, or questions about the candidate's moral standing. A secret addendum from 1590 classifies certain denials as politically sensitive, referring to miracles attributed to individuals associated with controversial noble families. These entries remain sealed under a directive from Pope Clement VIII, requiring his explicit approval to unseal. When scholars examine the microfilm copies, they find footnotes questioning whether fear of papal embarrassment influenced outcomes. As you pore over the neat rows of names, dates, and verdicts, you confront the Church's painstaking effort to discern genuine divine intervention from popular fervor or human error. In the Archive of Denied Miracles, the Vatican Archives reveal the rigorous, sometimes contested vetting process that shaped the communion of saints. Among the Vatican's most enigmatic holdings is a missive addressed not to a mortal but to Lucifer himself, a ritual letter drafted in the archives under tightly controlled conditions. Written in 1745 by a clandestine circle of theologians, led by Carlo Alberto Guidobono Cavalcini, the letter invokes a summons to the fallen angel, demanding the disclosure of hidden sins plaguing Christendom. The original, bound in black goatskin, begins with a formal salutation. To you, adversary of souls, know that by the authority of Christ and the keys of Peter, we command your presence. Marginal commentaries by Cavalcini outline the prophetic purpose to shame corrupt prelates into repentance and to reclaim lost prayers. A later annotation by Cardinal Silvio Valenti Gonzaga questions the appropriateness of addressing a demonic power in a written document. Yet a summary report confirms the ritual was performed sealed in wax and placed overnight in the chapel of the Holy Sepulchre beneath the Lateran Basilica. The archives also preserve copies of the accompanying rite, including glyphs drawn in crimson ink and specific psalms designated for the exorcistic intent. In 1753, under pressure from the Holy Office, Guidobono's manuscript was ordered locked away, with a memorandum declaring it effective only in the presence of its original consecration. Subsequent inventories list the letter under obscura, objects too dangerous to catalog openly. Modern researchers who gain permission to view black and white reproductions find redacted passages, particularly those detailing punishments threatened against those who sell prayer for gold. As you read the faded Latin lines, you confront a church willing to deploy its most arcane rites against spiritual adversaries. In the letter to Lucifer, the Vatican Archives preserve an extraordinary document that blurs the line between sanctity and sorcery, revealing the depths to which faith may delve when confronting the abyss. At the heart of the Vatican Apostolic Archives lies the fabled final Ruma chamber shrouded in legend and accessible only to the reigning pope, referred to in archival cross-references as, quote, Cella Ultima, quote, this vaulted space is said to contain the sole surviving manuscript of every secret the Church has ever kept, from sorcerous grimoires to geopolitical pacts. Access protocols, codified by Pope Pius IX in 1854, require the Pope to sign 3 directives in Latin, each delivered by a different cardinal, before the chamber's door may be opened. The archives hold the registers of these directives, recorded but never publicly disclosed, along with handwritten instructions on ceremonial vestments to be worn by the pontiff in particular, a stole embroidered with symbols of the 4 evangelists. Inside, according to whispered testimonies in 18th century memoirs, stand 4 golden lecterns, each bearing a single bound volume, Veritas Tempus, Pacta Occulta, Literae Suffragii, and Mysterium Fidei. No modern document lists their contents. Scholars speculate they encompass everything from the original Acts of the Apostles to the Vatican's most sensitive intelligence reports. A conservation note from 1923 records the chamber's microclimate controls temperature and humidity tuned to preserve vellum, iron, and gold. Though many have sought permission to enter, including visiting heads of state and ecumenical delegations, none has been granted except the Pope himself. In the rare instances when the final room is opened, rumors suggest a hush falls over the palace, candles flicker, and the assembled cardinals kneel in silence as the Pope scans the volumes. The archives retain only a single line in the ledger, Dimittitur cum Domino, translated roughly as, it departs with the Lord, implying that knowledge within the final room remains forever under papal guard. As you imagine its threshold, you confront the ultimate paradox of the archives, that the Church's deepest secrets are both meticulously preserved and eternally beyond reach.